On a cold, frosty night, Mark and Susan noticed something unusual on the roadside. As they approached, they saw a shivering dog, scared and alone. Could they help this frightened creature? Welcome to Wonderbot Animals. Mark drove carefully, making sure the car stayed on course. Susan, sitting beside him, hummed softly to the radio. They were enjoying the quiet serenity of the drive, talking about the evening. As they travelled down a particularly desolate stretch of the highway, they both noticed something unusual by the roadside. There, barely visible under the faint glow of the streetlights, was a shivering dog. The animal looked cold and frightened, clearly out of place in the middle of nowhere. Mark slowed the car down to get a better look, while Susan leaned forward, trying to see if the dog was injured. Feeling a pang of sympathy for the poor creature, they decided to stop and see if they could help. Mark pulled the car over to the shoulder and they both got out. The cold wind bit at their faces as they approached the dog cautiously. The animal looked up at them with wide, fearful eyes. Susan bent down, extending her hand slowly, hoping to show the dog that they meant no harm. Mark, seeing the dog's shivering state, quickly returned to the car to grab a blanket they kept in the back seat. He gently wrapped the dog in the warm fabric, trying to protect it from the biting cold. The dog seemed to relax slightly, its shivering lessening a bit. Mark carefully lifted the dog into his arms, cradling it as if it were a fragile child, and carried it back to the car. Susan climbed back into the car and settled in the passenger seat. She reached out to comfort the dog, which now appeared weak and scared. The poor thing was trembling, but allowed Susan to softly stroke its head. Mark got into the driver's seat and started the engine. The heater was turned on full blast, enveloping them in a wave of warmth. They felt relieved to have rescued the dog from the cold. As they drove home, the couple discussed how they could care for the frightened creature. They tossed around ideas, from finding its owner to maybe adopting it themselves. Susan suggested they take the dog to the vet first thing in the morning to check for a microchip. Mark agreed, saying they should also get the dog some proper food and a warm bed. Their minds were already buzzing with plans. Once they arrived home, they immediately set to work preparing a cozy spot for the new guest. Susan laid out a soft, warm bed in a quiet corner of the living room. Mark poured some fresh water into a bowl and set out some food they had in the pantry. They both watched as the dog cautiously sniffed around, exploring its new surroundings. It seemed hesitant, but slowly began to relax. The dog cautiously began to explore the house, moving slowly as it inspected each room. It sniffed at the furniture, checked out corners, and even peeked under the table. Mark and Susan watched with a mix of curiosity and hope. They could see the dog was starting to show signs of trust, albeit gradually. Its movements became a bit more confident, and it seemed to understand that it was safe here. The next morning, they took the dog to the vet for a thorough checkup. The vet examined the dog carefully, looking for any signs of injury or illness. Mark and Susan stood nearby, anxiously waiting for news. The vet informed them that the dog was generally healthy, but a bit undernourished. They checked for a microchip, hoping to find the owner, but there was none. It seemed the dog was a stray. The vet discovered no microchip, but estimated that the dog was around 2 years old. This information brought a small sense of relief to Mark and Susan. At least they knew a bit more about their new companion. The vet provided some advice on how to care for the dog, recommending a nutritious diet and regular checkups. They left the vet's office with a sense of determination to give the dog a better life. After much discussion, Mark and Susan decided to keep the dog. It felt like the right thing to do after seeing how quickly they had bonded with the furry creature. They decided to name him Max, feeling it was a strong and fitting name for their new family member. Max seemed to respond well to his new name, wagging his tail each time they called out to him. Their decision had filled their home with newfound joy. Mark and Susan excitedly headed into town to shop for dog supplies. They wandered through aisles filled with colourful toys, comfortable beds, and various types of dog food. they carefully selected items that they hoped Max would love. High-quality kibble, a durable chew toy, and a stylish collar made their way into the cart. Returning home with bags full of goodies, they eagerly looked forward to integrating Max into their family. Max appeared to settle in well and even began to show his playful side. He would chase his new chew toy around the house and run excitedly in the backyard. Mark and Susan could hardly believe how quickly Max became an energetic and lively presence in their home. They spent hours playing fetch and teaching him basic commands. It seemed Max was just the perfect addition to their lives, bringing them both laughter and companionship. However, their joy was soon overshadowed by some strange behaviours that began to emerge. Max, who had initially seemed so gentle and playful, started acting unpredictably. At times, he would freeze and stare at empty corners, his hackles raised. Other times, he would dart from room to room, as if being chased by something unseen. These odd behaviours began to unsettle Mark and Susan, leaving them wondering what could be causing such changes. Max's behaviour took a more alarming turn when he began to growl aggressively at unexpected moments. The gentle dog they had brought home was now startling them with his sudden fits of aggression. He would growl and snarl without any apparent trigger, his eyes narrowing as if he saw something threatening. Mark and Susan found themselves increasingly on edge, unsure of how to handle these sudden behavioural shifts in Max. One night, Mark and Susan were jolted awake by the sound of frantic scratching. They rushed to the living room to find Max aggressively clawing at the front door. His growls were low and menacing, and his entire body was tense. It was as if he was trying to get out, or perhaps trying to keep something from getting in. They were deeply unsettled by this behaviour, not knowing what could be driving Max to act this way. Despite growing worries, Mark and Susan tried to rationalise Max's behaviour. They told themselves it was just nervousness or trauma from his past. After all, who knew what kind of life Max had before they found him shivering on that desolate highway? They hoped that with time and love, Max would overcome his fears and stop acting out. Still, they couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something wasn't quite right. In desperation, Susan enrolled Max in an obedience training class to curb his aggressive tendencies. She hoped professional guidance would help Max become a more predictable and well-behaved pet. They attended sessions diligently, practicing commands and reinforcing positive behaviours. If you love heartwarming animal stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to Wonderbot Animals for more touching tales. Max responded well at times, but often reverted to his aggressive and odd behaviours. Susan was determined, but couldn't help feeling that something deeper was at play with their erratic dog. During one of the training sessions, the trainer pulled Susan aside. He shared his observations, noting that Max seemed unusually difficult to control compared to other dogs. He pointed out that Max's aggression wasn't just a simple behavioural issue. It seemed to stem from something more complex. Hearing this, Susan grew even more concerned. She wondered if they had overlooked some critical aspect of Max's background, or if there was more to his story. Despite their best efforts, Max's behaviours grew increasingly unpredictable. One moment, he would be calm and affectionate. The next, he would be snarling and aggressive. Mark and Susan felt as though they were living with a stranger, never knowing what might trigger Max's next outburst. The peace and joy that Max initially brought to their home were overshadowed by a growing sense of unease. They began questioning whether adopting Max was the right decision. Mark decided to install a security camera in their living room to monitor Max's behaviour while they were not at home. He hoped that capturing footage might provide clues about what was triggering Max's odd actions. The process took an afternoon, setting up the camera angles, connecting it to their home network, and downloading the app. They felt a sense of relief, hoping the recordings could shed some light on Max's mysterious behaviour. Over the next few days, Mark and Susan reviewed the footage from the security camera. To their dismay, they saw Max pacing back and forth, barking at empty spaces, and even growling at seemingly nothing. At times, he would sit and stare intently at a corner of the room, as if he saw something they couldn't see. This disturbing behavior only deepened their concern and confusion about what was affecting their beloved pet. One evening, Mark and Susan returned home to find their living room in complete disarray. Couch cushions were torn and wooden furniture had been clawed and chewed up. It was clear that Max had been extremely agitated in their absence. The mess was worse than anything they had seen before. They couldn't understand what had caused Max to behave so destructively during the short time they were away. Determined to resolve the issue, Mark and Susan decided to give Max more attention and exercise. They took him on longer walks, played games to tire him out, and showered him with affection. Despite their best efforts, the incidents continued. Max remained unpredictable and destructive. Each time they thought they might have found a solution, Max's unexpected behaviours would resurface, leaving them frustrated and at a loss for what to do next. Max's unsettling behaviour extended to anyone who visited their home. He began growling at guests, creating an uncomfortable atmosphere during their gatherings. Friends and family were taken aback by Max's aggressive stance, and some were even scared to approach him. It became increasingly difficult for Mark and Susan to host people, as they never knew how Max would react. The joyful gatherings they once enjoyed became strained and awkward. In a bid to find answers, Mark and Susan decided to take Max to another veterinarian for a more thorough evaluation. They wanted to ensure there wasn't an underlying medical condition causing his behaviour. The new vet conducted a series of tests and observations, searching for clues. Mark and Susan anxiously awaited the results, hoping that this visit would finally provide the explanation they desperately needed for Max's strange actions. After a careful examination, the vet hinted at the possibility that Max might be experiencing trauma from his past. Though unable to provide concrete answers, the vet noted that some of Max's behaviours were consistent with dogs that had gone through severe stress or abuse. Hearing this, Mark and Susan felt a mix of sadness and frustration. Without knowing Max's full history, it was challenging to pinpoint the root cause of his troubling behaviour. Determined to uncover Max's past, Mark decided to conduct some research on his own. He spent hours online, digging through forums and articles about abandoned and stray dogs. He also reached out to local animal shelters, hoping someone might recognise Max. Each lead seemed to bring him closer to an understanding, but nothing substantial emerged. Mark found himself more intrigued and worried as he pieced together fragments of possible explanations. Susan decided to take a different approach by posting flyers and social media messages asking if anyone recognised Max. She included pictures and a detailed description, hoping that someone might come forward with information. She plastered the neighbourhood with flyers and shared the posts on various community groups online. They both hoped this effort would bring forth some answers about Max's mysterious history and help them understand what he had gone through. A few days later, they received an anonymous tip that darkened their hopes. The message hinted that Max might have darker origins than they had initially thought. The tip suggested that the dog could have been part of a clandestine and illegal operation. Mark and Susan were stunned and deeply troubled by this revelation. It seemed that their quest for answers was leading them down a path filled with more questions and growing dangers. The tip claimed that Max might have been part of an illegal operation, possibly involving police dog training or underground dog fights. Mark and Susan were horrified at the revelation. They could hardly believe Max, their once sweet pet, could have such a grim past. Can we get this video to 6,000 likes? Your support helps us share more incredible animal stories. This revelation made them more anxious and suspecting as they contemplated how to proceed. They knew they couldn't ignore the disturbing signs that had been haunting them. Shocked by the tip, Mark and Susan began to piece together the unsettling truth about Max. They reviewed everything they had observed, from Max's behaviour to the odd occurrences around their home. Every suspicious detail started to fit into a troubling picture of Max's past. They realised they had a dangerous and complicated situation on their hands, and it was more significant than just dealing with a traumatised pet. Realising they might be in over their heads, Mark and Susan contacted local authorities for assistance. They hoped the police or animal control could intervene, but their pleas fell on deaf ears. The authorities seemed disinterested or too busy to help, offering only generic advice. Frustrated and feeling more isolated, Mark and Susan understood they would have to take further action on their own to protect themselves and uncover the truth. As they continued digging into Max's past, the disturbing incidents around their home only intensified. Max's aggressive behavior became even more unpredictable, and ominous events started happening at night. Strange noises echoed through the house, and they often felt like they were being watched. Their once peaceful home no longer felt safe. Every creak and shadow increased their anxiety, knowing something sinister could be lurking just out of sight. One morning, they discovered strange markings near their windows and doors. The markings resembled symbols or messages, something they couldn't interpret but found deeply unsettling. It was as though someone had been lurking outside, leaving cryptic signs behind. This new development only added to their fear and confusion. Mark and Susan realized these were not just random acts of vandalism, but likely connected to Max's past and the warning they had received. Determined to protect their home and find some peace of mind, Mark decided to improve their home security. He added additional locks to all the doors and installed outdoor lighting to illuminate the property at night. They hoped these measures would deter anyone from approaching their home again. Although these steps made them feel slightly safer, the underlying fear remained. They couldn't shake the sense that they were being targeted for some unknown reason. As the strange incidents continued, Susan began to fear that keeping Max might have put them in danger. She voiced her concerns to Mark, suggesting they might need to find a more secure location or, heartbreaking as it was, consider rehoming Max. She felt they were living on a knife's edge, always on alert and never feeling truly safe. The once joyous adoption of Max now seemed like an ever-growing nightmare. Despite Susan's growing fears, Mark insisted on keeping Max until they could learn more about his origins. He believed that abandoning Max wouldn't solve their problems and that they owed it to the dog to understand what had happened to him. Mark's determination to protect Max and uncover the truth kept him focused, although it put additional strain on their relationship and added to the looming sense of dread. As the days passed, Max became increasingly aggressive and difficult to handle. Even simple tasks like feeding him or taking him for a walk turned into challenges. His unpredictable outbursts and the alarming strength behind his reactions made both Mark and Susan cautious around him. They found themselves on edge, constantly worrying about when and how Max might lash out next, making the situation even more tense and perilous. One afternoon, a stranger lingered outside their home, making them both uneasy. The man seemed to be observing their house, possibly even casing it. Mark approached him, but the stranger quickly walked away without saying a word. The unsettling encounter left both Mark and Susan even more paranoid. They couldn't shake the feeling that their home and lives had become entwined in something dangerous beyond their control. Feeling increasingly threatened, Mark and Susan decided to contact their neighbours. They asked them to keep an eye out for any suspicious activities and to report anything unusual. The neighbours, although concerned, agreed to help. It was a small relief to know they weren't entirely alone in this situation. Yet, the feeling of constantly being watched and the uncertainty about Max's past continued to cast a dark cloud over their lives. Despite their neighbours' support, Mark and Susan felt increasingly isolated and vulnerable. The eerie incidents continued, and even the smallest sound would set them on edge. Their once cosy home had become a place of perpetual fear. They found it challenging to talk to friends or family about their troubles, fearing they wouldn't understand or believe their unbelievable situation. The weight of their predicament rested solely on their shoulders. Max's health began to deteriorate, adding another layer of worry for Mark and Susan. They decided to take him to the vet, hoping for some answers or at least some relief for their beloved pet. However, the vet could offer little help. Max's aggressive behavior made it difficult to examine him thoroughly, and the vet seemed puzzled by his symptoms. They left feeling more helpless than ever, with no clear direction on how to proceed. One night, Mark received a mysterious phone call. The voice on the other end was unrecognizable, but the message was chillingly clear. They needed to get rid of Max. The caller warned them of grave consequences if they chose to keep him. Mark's blood ran cold as he listened, realizing this situation was far more dangerous than they had initially thought. He hung up, feeling a mix of fear and anger. Mark and Susan felt trapped between their love for Max and the mounting threat against them. The eerie incidents, the strange phone call, and Max's deteriorating condition made their home feel like a prison. They debated their options endlessly, but found no clear solution. They feared that giving Max away might not end their troubles, and they couldn't bear the thought of abandoning him in his condition. Desperation led Susan to consider taking Max to a shelter. She reasoned that a specialized facility might be better equipped to handle his aggression and health issues. However, Mark worried that handing Max over to strangers could be risky. They both harbored guilt over the possibility of abandoning Max, fearing he might fall into worse hands. It was a heart-wrenching decision, and they felt paralyzed by uncertainty. Out of the blue, they received another anonymous tip that led them to believe Max had been part of an underground dogfighting ring. This revelation was both disturbing and enlightening. It explained his aggressive behavior and health issues. Mark and Susan were horrified at the thought of Max being subjected to such cruelty. They realized they were entangled in a situation far more sinister than they had ever imagined. The tip about the dogfighting ring made Mark and Susan see Max in a new light. They realized his aggression might have been trained into him through abuse. Their hearts broke over the suffering he had endured. This understanding deepened their commitment to help him, but it also heightened their fear. They knew that those responsible for such cruelty could pose a serious threat to their safety as well. Desperate for guidance, Mark and Susan contacted an animal rights organization. They explained Max's situation and the disturbing discoveries they had made. The organization agreed to help, offering advice and resources. It was a small glimmer of hope in their otherwise bleak situation. They felt slightly reassured that professionals were now involved, though the underlying fear of those who had mistreated Max remained ever-present and ominous. The animal rights organization advised them to stay low and limit communication regarding Max. They explained that the people involved in illegal dogfighting rings could be extremely dangerous and unpredictable. Mark and Susan followed the advice, trying to keep their lives as normal as possible while staying vigilant. This new direction gave them a strategy, but the anxiety of ongoing threats and Max's condition still loomed large in their lives. One morning, Mark and Susan were shocked to find an anonymous note in their mailbox. The note was chilling, threatening harm if they didn't comply with unspecified demands. It was clear whoever left it knew their address and situation with Max. The threat was unnerving, and it sent a jolt of fear through both of them. They realized they could no longer ignore the serious danger they were in. Fearful for their safety and desperate for answers, Mark and Susan decided they needed to confront the people behind the operation. They debated whether to go to the police or take matters into their own hands. Ultimately, they felt the authorities had been too slow, and they needed immediate action. They started devising a plan to infiltrate and understand who was behind the threatening note and Max's mysterious past. To gather more information, they decided to meet the tipster who had contacted them before. The person agreed to meet, but demanded anonymity and extreme caution. Arrangements were made to meet at a secluded location under the cover of darkness. Mark and Susan felt anxious but determined, hoping this meeting would provide crucial details to better understand the dangerous situation they were entangled in and how to navigate it. At the meeting, the tipster revealed some alarming facts. The individuals involved in the dogfighting ring were not only dangerous, but well connected. They had a history of eliminating threats with brutal efficiency. This information was both enlightening and terrifying. Mark and Susan realized the risk to their lives had grown exponentially. Yet, the clarity of knowing what they were up against provided a grim sense of direction. As the days passed, the intensity of the threat became more tangible. Strange vehicles started appearing near their house, and unfamiliar people seemed to be watching their movements. Mark and Susan felt like prisoners in their own home, their anxiety mounting with each passing day. The surveillance was a constant reminder of the dangerous game they were now a part of, heightening their sense of helplessness and fear. Mark decided to bolster their home security. He installed additional security cameras around the perimeter of their house and set up a panic system that would alert authorities immediately. Susan helped by ensuring all windows and doors were secured and frequently tested the alarms. Though the increased security gave them a slight sense of control, the looming threat and pervasive watching eyes kept them constantly on edge. Susan began meticulously documenting all unusual events around their home. She kept a journal of the strange vehicles, odd noises, and any peculiar interactions they had. They even captured footage from the security cameras. This documentation was meant to serve as potential evidence to present to the authorities or the animal rights organization. It also helped them feel a sense of control and purpose amid the ongoing chaos. While dealing with external threats, Max's behavior took a turn for the worse. He became more unstable and aggressive, often growling or snapping at the slightest provocation. His unpredictable behavior added to the already high levels of stress and fear Mark and Susan were experiencing. They considered sedating him or finding a specialist, but those options were temporary solutions to a problem that seemed to grow each day. Despite their constant efforts to document and report the strange occurrences, the authorities were frustratingly slow to act. Police visits often resulted in vague reassurances and promises that led nowhere. Mark and Susan felt their desperation and helplessness deepen. It became clear they needed to rely on their own measures and the support of the animal rights organization to navigate the increasingly perilous situation with Max. On a freezing night, Mark and Susan's worst fears materialized. An intruder broke into their home, shattering the fragile sense of security they had left. In the chaos, Max viciously attacked the intruder, his growls and barks echoing through the cold air. By the time Mark and Susan reached Max, the intruder had been driven off, wounded. They were left shaken, realizing the very real dangers now facing them. Frightened by the break-in, Mark rushed to send the footage of the intruder and Max's attack to the authorities. He meticulously compiled all the evidence they had gathered so far and sent it in an urgent email. While sending the footage, he couldn't help but hope this would finally make the authorities take their case seriously. The process was nerve-wracking, but Mark knew they had no other choice now. The authorities, finally moved by the urgency and the visual proof, took their case seriously. Detectives visited their home, setting up proper surveillance and offering them protection. Patrol cars began to frequent their neighborhood, providing a semblance of safety. The offer of protection brought a small measure of relief to Mark and Susan. They were finally being heard, and the authorities were now fully on their side. As the police investigation progressed, the true scale of the illegal operation began to unfold. The ring was larger and more intricate than anyone had realized, involving numerous individuals and locations. Undercover agents began to infiltrate the network, gathering substantial evidence to bring those involved to justice. Mark and Susan felt a mix of relief and shock at the extent of the criminal activity that had ensnared them. Amid the police investigation, Max's original owners tried to reclaim him illegally through legal loopholes. They presented fraudulent documents and attempted to manipulate the legal system to get Max back. Mark and Susan were furious and terrified. They knew Max was safer with them. Their determination to protect him solidified. They decided to fight back with every piece of evidence and resource they had at their disposal. Mark and Susan mobilized their collected evidence to counter the claims of Max's original owners. They collaborated closely with the authorities, ensuring every detail was scrutinized and the illegal connections were unveiled. The evidence was irrefutable, making it clear that the original owners were deeply involved in the nefarious operation. Their persistence paid off as the court ruled in favor of keeping Max with Mark and Susan. A tense standoff ensued when law enforcement confronted the key individuals involved in the operation. Mark and Susan could only watch from a distance as the police moved in. After hours of negotiation, the situation culminated in a series of dramatic arrests. Seeing the culprits in handcuffs brought a wave of relief to the couple. The danger they had faced seemed to dissipate with each arrest made. With the capture of his abusers, Max's behavior began to change noticeably. He seemed less aggressive and more at ease. It was as though the tension and fear that had gripped him were slowly being released. Mark and Susan observed these changes with cautious optimism, grateful that Max could start to heal from his traumatic past. Their home gradually returned to a more peaceful and stable environment. As their ordeal wound down, the couple considered rehabilitation for Max. They researched options and consulted professionals who specialized in animal behavior. The goal was to help Max overcome his traumatic experiences and adjust to a loving and safe environment. Mark and Susan were committed to providing Max with the support he needed. The first steps towards his rehabilitation marked a new chapter in their journey together. With the immediate danger averted, Mark and Susan firmly decided that Max deserved a chance at a better life. They reflected on everything they had gone through and the bond they had formed with Max. Despite the initial regrets, they saw the potential for a happier future. The couple was resolved to provide the care and love Max needed to recover from his traumatic past and live peacefully. Mark and Susan began working with an animal behavior specialist to help Max recover. The specialist created a detailed plan tailored to Max's needs, focusing on building trust and reducing anxiety. The couple diligently followed the specialist's advice, dedicating time and effort to Max's rehabilitation. By providing a stable and nurturing environment, they hoped to help Max heal and transform into a happy, well-adjusted dog. If you were in Mark and Susan's place, what would you have done? How would you handle a stray dog in need? Share your thoughts in the comments below.